Okay, we're recording again. Our first speaker is Brittany Polat from Tampa, and I'll turn it over to her now, and she'll be able to share her screen.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, sharing. See if this works. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Thumbs up. All right. Well, thank you, Dan. It's great to be here with you all today. I think we can all agree it's a good time to be a Stoic, right? This has been a crazy year, so it's great to be a Stoic during crazy times, all the time, but especially now. And I wanted to share with you today the idea of Stoicism as higher education. So not something that we learn at one time in our lives and then kind of forget about, but kind of an ongoing, lifelong, continuing education. And my talk today is based on an essay by Pierre Hadot. So I think maybe some of you are familiar with Pierre Hadot's work. He was really associated with the idea of philosophy as a way of life. He did a lot of research. He's a classical scholar, and he did a lot of research on philosophy in ancient times, how it was really conceptualized as a way of life, not theory, or not just theory, but theory and practice together. So Stoicism, I think, is the education that we all need right now. And I'd really like to look at this idea and kind of where it came from and how it can help us today as Stoics. So Pierre Hadot says that he's writing an essay to an American philosopher named Hilary Putnam in honor of Putnam. And he cites Putnam saying, you know, of all the definitions of philosophy I've ever seen, this one is my favorite, from Stanley Cavell, another mid-century American philosopher. Philosophy is the education of grown-ups. This is what it is at heart. And why is that? Why can we say that philosophy is adult education? Well, quite simply because the philosophical question par excellence, the question that all philosophers since Socrates have been working on, is how should we live? And this is a question that interests everyone, says Hadot. If this is the philosophical question, then philosophy is the education of grown-ups because it interests all of us, each individual person. It's not just a matter of the theory or the discourse of philosophy, but in our everyday lives. And so when we step back and think about it, we can see that all of our decisions, big and small, revolve around this question of how we should live. So the big questions: what should my career be? Should I marry this person? Should we have children? Some of the smaller questions: should I go on vacation? Should I read this book? And even our everyday questions. When you wake up in the morning, you're asking yourself, okay, what should I do today? Or how should I respond when this person insults me? All of these are about this bigger question of how we should live. And it's true that some people don't think it through very clearly. Some people aren't really pausing to reflect on this question. But when we do, it's the question for all of us. So if we compare children's education, they're learning how to see the world, how to put facts together and learn about things. We can make a comparison for ourselves as adults. We're still doing the same thing, just in a different way, and maybe on a bigger scale. So the ancients had this idea as well of philosophy as a way of life. How should we live? And each ancient philosophical school had a different idea of the way of the answer to this question. So they all assumed we all want to be happy. And I think we can safely assume this today, right? All normal adults, unless there's some kind of incapacity or mental illness going on, we all want to live happy, live happily and be happy. We want good and meaningful lives. So how do we do this? Well, of course, the Stoic answer to this question is you become an excellent person. You live a fulfilling life by doing what people are meant to do, which is inner excellence and justice, wisdom, self-control, that kind of thing. So looking back to the ancient Stoics, we have several different models of how education might look for adults. Maybe the most obvious is Epictetus. He was actually a teacher. He instructed young adults in his classroom. He ran a philosophical school. And he also talked with community members, older citizens who would stop by to have a chat or listen to his lectures. So in a very real way, Epictetus was involved in philosophy as the education of grown-ups. And he talks about it in his discourses. He says the properly educated person knows how to apply their preconceptions in the proper way, not just making assumptions about things, but really thinking things through, rejecting opinion to find that straight and narrow rule. He says the properly educated person will know how to submit or align their desires with the way of the world, instead of expecting the world to conform to their desires. This is the role of education. So he's actually talking a lot about education and how a philosophical education results in a good life. In fact, he says, this is how you know if you're properly educated. He compares it to a carpenter. A carpenter doesn't stand around talking about how to build something, how to build a house or a cabinet. The carpenter builds the house or the cabinet. And this is how you know if they have received the proper training and if they're a good carpenter. So philosophy is somewhat similar. We're not standing around talking about how to do philosophy. We're not necessarily writing treatises or reading advanced theoretical treatises. We're living it every day. This is how we know if we're properly educated. We have another model of education in Seneca with his moral letters, which Dan already mentioned. He's writing to his friend Lucilius with moral instruction, encouragement, exhortation. He's not claiming to be a sage, but he is claiming to be someone who's a little bit more advanced on the path toward wisdom and a happy or a good life. He's reaching his hand back, helping out his friend Lucilius. Or he also wrote consolation letters, for example, to members of his family and his friends. So we have the model of the guide in Seneca. In Epictetus, we have the model of education in an actual philosophical school. And in Marcus Aurelius, we have the model of self-education. So his meditations, clearly, Marcus is rehearsing these philosophical concepts that he had learned from his tutors and teachers earlier. And now he's on his own. So he's applying them to his own life in his own way. So I think all of these are really valuable models of education that we can still refer to today. Obviously, most of us are not lucky enough to attend a philosophical school, but we can attend philosophical meetups. We can look to friends and guides. And of course, we can work on our own for that self-education. So leaving the ancients behind for just a moment and turning to a modern philosopher, Emmanuel Kant, who, as you probably know, is a giant of Enlightenment philosophy. So Hadot, in his essay on philosophical education, relies a lot on Kant's ideals of wisdom. So I love this quote from Kant: "Not even the slightest degree of wisdom can be poured into a man by others. Rather he, or obviously she, or they, can pour it forth from himself." So this is what we're really working towards, is bringing it forth from ourselves, this inner cultivation of virtue and of happiness. It reminds me also of a quote from Marcus Aurelius, where he says, "You have goodness within you, a fountain of goodness. If only you dig, always dig, and your fountain of goodness can be gushing forth." So I love this idea. We're cultivating it. We're drawing this out of ourselves. And of course, we know that nobody can do this work for us. If you've ever been a teacher, you know that you can't impart it to anybody else. If you've ever been a learner, you know that you can't take it from somebody else. You have to do it for yourself. You have to put in the work. So as Stoics in our difficult continuing education, we need to keep working in this direction. And Kant has some suggestions for us. He calls them maxims. He loved his maxims, but I think of them as suggestions or guidelines. And I've kind of tweaked and updated them a little bit for us today, but this is pretty much what Kant lays out. He says, if you're seeking wisdom, this is what you need to do. First, think for yourself. Next, you need to think consistently with yourself. And you also need to think outside yourself. And he actually phrases it as think into the place of the other in communication with other humans. This is how he phrases it. So I've called it think outside yourself, and we'll look in more detail at all of these. So first step, think for yourself. And another way of looking at this is doing what Epictetus's teacher, Musonius Rufus, calls getting rid of thoughtless habit. So as Dan mentioned earlier, we all kind of accumulate these bad mental habits over time. Before we're interested in philosophy, before we know anything about Stoicism, we kind of grow up looking at what other people value and thinking, oh, okay, if I get rich or if I gain a certain social status, it's going to make me happy. And we kind of coast along through life, a lot of us do, just kind of doing whatever comes to us, maybe following gut intuitions or just reacting emotionally to what's happening around us. And what we need to do is get rid of this thoughtless habit. So how do we do this? Well, Epictetus says, look, here's the starting point of philosophy. The recognition that different people have different opinions, conflicting opinions, the rejection of mere opinion so that it comes to be viewed with mistrust, an investigation of opinion to determine whether it's rightly held, and the discovery of a standard of judgment, like a balance or a scale or a carpenter's rule or any other tool that you have to make sure that you're straight and you're measuring things properly. So he actually lists these 4 different steps. First, recognize that different people have conflicting opinions. I know in my life this happened when I was going along pretty well, and then I had children, and all of a sudden I hit a wall. Wow, what do I do now? You're confronted with lots of different opinions about how to raise a child, how to be as a parent, but it's the same in a lot of different situations. So something happens in your life, or maybe you notice that party A says we should live it one way, party B says, no, this is the right way to live. Party C has a different suggestion. In our very complex society today, there's such a proliferation of opinions about lifestyles, about the right way to be. How do we know what the proper way is? How do we know how we should live and how we should be happy? So Epictetus says the next step is rejection of mere opinion. Anyone who claims to be right just because it's them, just because it's their opinion, we're going to sweep that to the side. Not good enough. We need an investigation to determine whether an opinion is rightly held. And we need to discover some kind of rule, some kind of ruler, some kind of guideline that can guide us in this very difficult task of living a good life. Okay, so how do we do this? Next comes step 2, think consistently with yourself. And I'm going back to the original Stoic conception of our purpose in life here, living in agreement. So Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, his slogan of our end goal, our purpose in life, is to live in agreement. It's very similar. It's pretty much interchangeable with the other idea you might have heard, live in agreement with nature, also live in agreement with virtue. But the idea is that you're consistent, you're a coherent person. All of your desires, aversions, opinions, motivations, and actions are in agreement with each other, right? Your sense of self, who you are as a person, your choices, all of this is in alignment if you live in agreement. And Zeno says, if you're inconsistent, if you're living inconsistently, you can't be happy. If you want to live a good life, if you want to have a good flow of life, you need to live in agreement. So we're kind of grouping ourselves into a coherent person here. Epictetus says he's talking to his students and he's scolding them. He says, look, you sometimes think you're an athlete. Sometimes you act like a gladiator. Sometimes you're a philosopher, sometimes an orator, but nothing at all wholeheartedly. Like an ape, you imitate everything that you see. And one thing after another is always catching your fancy, but it ceases to amuse you after you grow accustomed to it. You've never embarked on anything after due consideration, not after having subjected it to proper examination or testing it out, but always at random and in a half-hearted fashion. This is some really tough love from Epictetus, for sure. I don't know what his students did to provoke this, but it is a fair description of the way some people live. if you're not devoted, if you don't have some kind of idea in mind of what you're living for, it's very easy to bounce around. Or they used the comparison of a puppet. You're a puppet on a string, just being pulled around in different directions all the time. You can't really be happy this way. This is the idea behind Stoicism. If you want to be happy, you need to find something that's worth living for. So what could be worth this much? If we're going to align ourselves, if we're working this hard to be consistent and coherent, we need to make sure we're directing our energy in the right place. So Marcus Aurelius gives us an idea of this here. He says, firstly, never act at random and without clear reference to an end. So there's your purpose, always living in agreement, being coherent. And second, refer your action to no other end than the common good. So here's our direction, is justice, virtue, right? We're not just living for our own narrow interests. We're kind of expanding to think about the bigger picture. The ancient Stoics like to use the analogy of a hive and bees in the hive. What's good for the hive is good for the individual bee. And really thinking through human nature, what kind of people are we? What do humans do? Well, we're very intelligent. We have these advanced cognitive capacities, and we're very social. So anything that we want to do, anything that makes us an excellent person, is going to involve those two facets together. So never act without clear reference to an end, and refer your action to no other end than the common good. This is also related to step 3 of getting outside yourself, or as Kant phrased it, thinking into the place of the other. And I love Pierre Hadot's phrase here, liberate yourself from your own partial point of view. Like we're kind of trapped inside our individual minds, and we need to liberate ourselves and be able to see the bigger picture and what other people are thinking about or experiencing as well. So Marcus here, he's doing a lot in this quote. I love this quote. So we'll go through each one individually. He says, make haste to look into your own ruling center and that of the universe and that of your neighbor. So he's reminding us, like we looked at before, where we need to be consistent. We need to think about our own thoughts and own actions. So look into your own self, your own ruling center, to ensure that your mind holds to justice. Look into that of the universe to remind yourself of what whole you form a part, and into that of your neighbor to know whether ignorance or judgment rules, and to recognize at the same time that his mind is of one nature with your own. So this last part here about other people is what I'm going to focus on, because it aligns with Kant's idea of thinking in communication with other people. First of all, we want to know, when we're interacting with other people, what are this person's priorities? What does this person value? Is it ignorance or judgment? And by good judgment, the Stoics meant valuing virtue. So this is where I think we can start thinking about online activity as well. If you're with a neighbor, if you're standing with another person, it's a lot easier to get to know them, to get to know their judgments. If you're interacting with someone online, very difficult to know what their judgments are. If you can't tell what someone else is thinking or what they value, it's perfectly reasonable to suspend judgment about that person. But that means that if that person is telling you what to do, you're not necessarily going to give much value to their opinion if you don't know whether ignorance or judgment rules in that person. We only want to give credence to opinions that we know are based on virtue. At the same time, we want to recognize that other people have minds of one nature with our own. So the goal here is not to feel superior to other people, or to blame other people, or to get upset with others. The goal is simply to understand with respect and compassion that other people have different opinions from us. Maybe we don't agree with them, but we can still respect and treat them in a charitable and compassionate way. And Epictetus reminds us again that even if someone doesn't share our opinions, we still owe them kindness and help. A good guide, when he sees someone wandering astray, doesn't abandon him with a dose of mockery or abuse, but leads him back to the proper path. So you too should show him the truth, and you'll see how he follows. As long as you fail to make it clear to him, though, you shouldn't make fun of him, but should recognize your own incapacity instead. So we can certainly engage with people about a wide range of topics, but we do so respectfully and with the ideal of seeking truth, not trying to prove that we're right. It's not about that. It's about trying to understand and maintain that Socratic spirit of kind of, we're all looking for the right way to live here. Let's do it together and let's do it charitably. So it's a tall order, right? This is a very difficult lifelong task, but how do we get there? What are some ways that we can start working towards this goal? Well, think for yourself for this guideline. I think one way we can start is to just keep asking questions. We're rejecting mere opinion, and we try to keep digging. When you meet someone in person, when you meet someone online, wherever you're going, keep asking questions. Maintain that that skeptical pose that Dan was talking about earlier. We're not going to accept someone's opinion just because they say so. So keep thinking for yourself. If you want to think consistently with yourself, I think one of the most important things we can do is just to focus on what's important. In any given situation, identify what's important. And it's almost always going to be, virtue, wisdom, courage, justice, self-control. If you focus on those things that are important, the rest of it doesn't seem worth getting upset about. The rest of it doesn't seem literally important because you are focused on the end game, your consistent purpose in life. For think outside yourself, again, we need to show humility. This is a virtue that's not often talked about today, but I think we would all benefit from remembering that we all have the same foibles and cognitive biases. Some of us are a little bit more aware of them than others, and we can try to reduce those, but we all have the same types of minds. So we need to be humble about our own opinions and at the same time show respect and compassion to others. So it's a tall order. It is a lifelong continuing education. But if we do these things, as Marcus Aurelius tells us, if you accomplish this task set before you, you will live a happy life and no one can stand in your way. So that's the goal of our Stoic education. And I hope you found this somewhat useful, maybe sparked some thoughts, some different ways of looking about things. And I would love to hear from you. If you ever want to get in touch, you can reach me through my website, livinginagreement.com, or you can reach me on Twitter. And I would love to hear your questions and comments. Thank you.
That was super, Brittany, and I love the imagery in your slides.
Thank you.
Those are beautiful images of wilderness and nature. The first question that we have is, by the way, for any of you who want to submit more questions, just put it in the chat window, starting with an exclamation mark, and then I'll know that you're posing a question for Brittany. The first question is, you mentioned excellence early in the presentation, and there are some keywords that Stoics use, like virtue and excellence. Can you talk a little bit about what, maybe there are even other keywords, and how do they all fit into the puzzle?
Well, I'm really focused on this idea of virtue as transforming your inner disposition. So virtue is not necessarily about external display, but about your, kind of like Dan mentioned earlier, your inner fortress, who you are as a person. I think it really fits in with your identity and your sense of self as well. So inner excellence is about who you are as a person, and you can think about the context of your whole life. So who you are as a person is going to guide your actions, your happiness, everything about you. It's all wrapped up into this one package. Dan, did you have a specific question about that, or were you looking for just a general explanation?
Just general.
Yeah, so of course, this is what the ancient Stoics said is going to result in our happiness. Not pleasure. It's not seeking pleasure or avoiding pain, like the ancient Epicurean said, or the ancient Aristotelian said, well, virtue is great, but it's not enough to be happy. You also need to be have a certain social status or have a certain amount of wealth and friends. The Stoics said, no, your purpose as a person is this inner excellence. And Epictetus, I think, compares compares our nature to, he's looking at different types of creatures, animals. So he says horses, their nature is to run swiftly. So you know a good horse when you see it running swiftly. This is when a horse is happiest, when it's doing what a horse is meant to do. And this is how you judge the excellence of a horse. So the same for people. If we want to think about what excellence is for a person, we can look at human nature. What are we meant to be doing? And so this is why I was mentioning earlier, human nature is based on our advanced cognitive capacities and our complex social worlds, our sociality. It's really interesting. If you look at evolutionary psychology, a lot of what I'm reading says that the two go hand in hand. They kind of co-evolved. Our intelligence and our sociability go together. So it's really interesting to think about, at the heart of human nature, this is what we're meant to do. And I think the Stoics got that right.
Great. All right. The next question is related to the quote that you had from Emmanuel Kant, ending with "from himself." In other words, the wisdom needs to come from himself. It occurs to me that that's very similar to the Taoist idea of, I can only show you the door, but you must walk through the door. And this is not just a good comparison, but it's really pivotal for Stoics because we are a practice-based philosophy. So could you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, and I love drawing in these ideas from other wisdom traditions as well. Taoism, Confucianism, I've been looking into Confucianism a lot. And I think obviously the Stoics don't have a monopoly on virtue or on wisdom. So I really like bringing in these kind of universal ideas of wisdom. So again, it's something that is about changing your inner disposition. Nobody else can do it for you. You have to put in the hard work. And I think it can be hard to stay motivated at times. This is one of the biggest questions confronting a Stoic, I think. We might say, oh yeah, this sounds great. I'd love to move in that direction. How do I stay motivated when I'm actually standing there starting to feel angry? What do I do? And I think I found in my practice, this is just my opinion, but I think it all goes back to this idea of we all want to be happy. We need to tap into our natural desire for happiness. And once you start down the Stoic path, maybe you read your first book and you start putting a few of these ideas into practice, I think you can quite quickly see some improvement. You might see an improvement in your happiness and you say, okay, good, I'm moving in the right direction. So you continue to practice and you see another increase in your happiness. So the more you do it, the more you get into it, the more you are feeling like you're living a good life. So for me, that has been very motivating when I see how far I've come from the person I used to be to where I am now. And I think, if I can just keep moving, keep practicing, keep working on this inner transformation, I'm going to get that much closer to this deep, rich, fulfilling eudaimonia, is what the ancient Greeks called it. So I think when it comes to motivation to keep practicing, you just look at, how am I really going to be happy? How am I really going to live a good life? And kind of let that be your guide and your motivation.
Thank you. And Mark has a follow-up question about Kant. He asks if there's any recommended works by Kant that helps learning about philosophy or Stoicism.
Oh, I am not a Kant scholar at all, so I'm not the right person to say that. I really set a lot of store by Pierre Hadot's opinion. And since he writes about Kant, I really respect that. I can give you recommendations, for Hadot's work. The Inner Citadel, if you've read some basic Stoic works and you really want to go deeper, definitely recommend the Inner Citadel. Or he has other works, What is Ancient Philosophy? He's well known for the idea of spiritual exercises. So anything that's been translated by Pierre Hadot is excellent. I can recommend. Sorry, I can't do any Kant recommendations.
That's okay. Candace asks a question. She says she loves what you said about having to do the work and not simply following someone else in an unqualified or unquestioned way. That said, it can be somewhat difficult for people given where they are intellectually, emotionally, or spiritually. Liberating yourself from your own thoughts in order to be more available to others' ideas seems critical to intellectual and objective growth. How did you personally come to a place where you were ready to no longer just follow?
For me personally, it was the result of my life experiences. Like I mentioned a little bit, I was doing just fine up until the time when I had children. And basically, my career goals, my family life, everything just collided together. And I had to find some kind of guide to get me through it. It was really difficult. I mean, I was pretty depressed at the time. I ended up leaving my career, and it was really difficult. So I just went online one day and typed in books about wisdom. And I found the book by William Irvin, A Guide to the Good Life. So for me, it was a very obvious break with, oh my gosh, I'm lost. I need something. I think it can happen differently for different people, obviously. I mean, just looking around the world and seeing so many conflicting opinions and people who are not gracious to others, people who believe that they're right just because it's their opinion or just because the people they're around think it's right. So much lack of reflection today. I think that might be enough to drive a lot of people to look for an answer, or what Epictetus calls the rule or the scales. So I think it can happen differently in different lives, the way things always do.
Tim has a question. Did you look into the work of David Hume?
I am starting, so I don't have any background in philosophy. So I've had to come kind of late to the party for all the other non-Stoic philosophers. I do like Hume. He was not really a fan of the Stoics. So it's interesting to think about. I think he kind of misunderstood some of the Stoic ideas. We're really, really fortunate in the 21st century to have so much excellent scholarship on Stoicism that has filled in some of the holes. So much of the Stoic works were lost, and we wouldn't know nearly as much about some of those core concepts in Stoicism from the Greek Stoics. Of course, we have the Roman Stoics, but we wouldn't know nearly as much as we do without the excellent, excellent scholarship that has taken place in the past 50 years. So I think Hume and people who came before this flourishing in the past 50 years didn't have the advantages we do of being able to understand the Stoics so well.
Good. Tim's question also reminds me that there are lots of great thinkers through history. Some of those that I have been fascinated with are Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, because of their work on social contract. And that's, of course, not Stoicism, but it is a related area. When you put them, if you drew them on a piece of paper, they'd be intersecting. And there's a lot of interesting, I think that's a great part of our philosophy education, is to study these other people, whether they were Stoics, Stoic writers, or just Stoic influenced.
Absolutely.
All right, Candace has a follow-up question. Do you see that the Stoic way leads to great self-confidence or efficacy, which then leads to greater happiness?
Definitely self-confidence, for sure. When you're no longer depending on other people's opinions as your guide, you definitely have a lot more self-confidence. That's one thing that I've noticed. And that was one of my major weaknesses before. I don't know if it afflicts women maybe more than men, trying to please other people and depending on what other people think about you. But it has definitely, definitely helped me as a person, as a parent, in my work and my writings on Stoicism. That's one of the major benefits. And so, yes, you do experience more happiness when you're not dependent on externals. Other people's opinions are external to you. So if you don't depend on those anymore, you are more happy, for sure.
Good. Our friend Rick in Tampa is asking, inner peace is easy to judge when you have achieved it, but inner excellence may be based on an ideal that might not be reachable. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. It is based on an ideal. It was based on the ideal of human nature for the ancient Stoics. And definitely, they didn't necessarily say that it's achievable. Not for most of us, maybe not ever. I think there was some debate on whether anyone had ever achieved the ideal to become a sage. Nevertheless, I do think it offers a great inspiration for us. Even if personally, I never expect to reach the ideal. I know I'm never going to be a sage, but when like I was saying earlier, when I see how far I've come, it inspires me to keep going that much more. And Pierre Hadot actually has this really great, I love this image. He says the path toward wisdom is like an asymptote. So if you picture an X and Y axis, and then the asymptote, which goes almost and almost touches the axis, but it never actually touches. It just gets incrementally closer forever. So to me, that's a really good way to picture what we're trying to do here. And every little bit that you get closer to that inner excellence, to that ideal, leads you to become a better and happier person. So for me, I don't have a problem knowing I'm never going to reach that ideal. Just the journey, it's the path that leads to greater happiness, I think.
Great. I'm so glad for all these questions. We have about 42 people on the call. And the next question comes from Rogine, who asks that, she says, I struggle with how to use time, such as kindness versus study. How does a Stoic manage their time?
Well, you definitely want to stay focused on what matters, I think. So I'm not sure if the question means, I guess in a general sense, like, do you spend more time out there doing altruistic acts or learning? Is that what you mean, Rogine?
Yeah, I think that's what she means. I mean,
Okay.
in a modern age, so many things are pressing on us.
Mm-hmm. I think that when you're out doing altruistic acts, you are studying. So it's not an either or. You're actually putting your philosophy into practice. That is the philosophy. So Epictetus would say, sitting at home, sitting in your armchair, reading about philosophy, you're not actually doing philosophy. You are doing the theory of philosophy. Doing philosophy is when you're out doing it. And we know that the Stoics were very big believers in being involved in society. So I would say, if you have to choose, do I spend more time with my books, or do I spend more time out there helping people or getting involved in the world? I would say choose the action part. I think it also depends on your, your life circumstances, your personality. For me, I'm extremely introverted, so I know if I don't start my day reading my Epictetus, I'm gonna kind of go downhill throughout the day. So I have to make that time, have to make time for that. And then I'm kind of more invigorated to go out and do the things I need to do. So I think it depends. I know a lot of people who just aren't really readers, they're more active. And so for those people, maybe they don't need to put in that time. So it's all about knowing what works for you, what opportunities you have in life. And that's kind of applying your practical wisdom, applying your judgment in that area.
That's
Yeah,
helpful.
I like that,
Thank you.
that perspective. I like that perspective because it also reinforces the general Stoic ideal that Stoicism is a guide. It is not an exact formula. So therefore, it gives you some ways to make decisions, to be focused, but the rest is going to be up to you.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. Another question is, you mentioned in your presentation about living according to nature, and I think you mentioned the common good also. These are some general terms that I find are bridges to other areas of thinking. For example, when we talk about the common good, that's what humanistic people think about. And there's also utilitarianism. There are all these branches of philosophy and thought. Can you think of, in the modern conversation, are there any other general terms that we should look out for?
In modern Stoicism,
Yep.
or just in philosophy? Well, a term that I didn't bring up, but that is very near and dear to my heart, is oikiosis. So this was kind of what I've been talking about this whole time about education and continual education. Well, the ancient Stoics had a term for it, and it was oikiosis. It was their term for development. And they looked at kind of two strands of development. One was your personal inner development, where it's based on the idea that all organisms, all animals, are interested in self-preservation. Every organism is constituted to preserve itself and advance its own interests. So in young children or animals, pre-rational humans and animals, it's in the form of staying alive. So if you think about a human infant, they are programmed instinctually to enjoy the loving embrace of a caregiver, to turn towards food. They're programmed to stay alive at that age. That's appropriate to their nature. That's what they're designed to do. Then as the child starts to get older and develop, they gain more awareness. They start to figure out their role in the world. And eventually, if we develop properly, and that's a big if, then we start to realize that the things that just preserve my life or the things that preserve my social status are not necessarily appropriate for my nature. So this is the big shift towards virtue that the Stoics talked about. Eventually, you're going to realize that just grabbing more stuff for myself doesn't lead to a better life. It doesn't lead to a better life for me. I'm not going to be happy that way. Instead, what leads to a better life, if I want to preserve my nature, if I want to be the person I'm supposed to be and live the life I'm supposed to live that will result in my happiness, it is to focus on the common good instead. And that's not to say that you should, always focus on everyone to the exclusion of yourself. That's not it. But like I was saying earlier, what's good for the hive is good for the bee. Or Marcus Aurelius has this really memorable comparison where he says, if you're acting against the common good, if you're being unsociable, it's like cutting off a body part. You have cut yourself off from the rest of humanity. So the ancient Stoics often talked about, they compared society to a human body and said, we're all members of this body. So it's a very, very tight relationship that they're thinking about here. So if we develop properly, if we go through this process of education, if we become the type of person that we're supposed to be, then we understand just preserving ourselves isn't what it's about. What it's about is looking at the whole. So I think a lot of Stoic philosophy is actually trying to get us to look at the whole. If you think about the view from above, this very well-known exercise, the point of view from the cosmos, where you kind of zoom out, you distance yourself from the immediate situation you're in so that you can see the bigger picture and say, okay, I'm just one of 7 billion people here. There's a lot going on. There are billions of organisms. There's things that I don't even know about. So taking that view, it's all about seeing yourself as a part of the whole. And it's not to say that you're not important, because each one of us is a significant part. And the ancient Stoics said that humans are the most significant part because of our rationality, and we have the potential to improve the whole. So we're a very significant part. Each one of us is. However, we are just one part. So I love this idea of oikiosis, and it really ties into lifelong education and the quest for a good life, I think.
Great. Yeah, a lot of what you were saying relates to the popular Stoicism term today called Cosmopolitanism. And it's a long word, Cosmopolitanism. But if for those of you who want to learn more about how we should be connecting with others in the present, today, you can Google Stoicism and Cosmopolitanism, and you'll see that there are articles by the scholars like Massimo and others who do comment on it. But if you're interested in going further, I've noticed, I've started studying recently, there was a historian in the 1980s called James Burke, and he had a TV series called Connections. And in those Connections series, he explored how we are connected in the past, how one society led to another, or one invention led to another to bring us into the present. And he showed how very much connected we are and how we can also fail together. The pilot episode of his Connections show was about the great New York City blackout from, I think it was 1965, or I can't remember the exact date, but it showed how multiple things failed and how therefore we needed to stick together. Going forward, Brittany, this will be the last question. How do you think we can balance our cosmopolitanism with other pressures on us in society?
Well, I'm not sure if this is how you meant the question, but I'm going to talk about how we can balance cosmopolitanism as thinking about the larger group with thinking about those humans that are close to us, because I think there's always a temptation to, go all touchy-feely, ooey-gooey, oh, the whole world, meanwhile, we're snapping at the person sitting next to us or not being charitable to our own neighbor. So I think, and it's interesting, we were talking about the variety of wisdom traditions earlier, and in so many different wisdom traditions, I see the same idea that you have to start by loving the people near you, by being charitable and respectful towards the person living across the street from you, or your family members. Even if you disagree with them, you still show charity and respect. And it's so hard. It's a lot easier to send good thoughts to a person on the other side of the world than to overcome your anger with someone who has just, gone back on their word to you or has failed to empty the dishwasher again, So, so this kind of thing, we need to balance out our compassion, not only for the bigger picture, but also those closest to us. In fact, I would say that you can't actually feel compassion or charity towards someone on the other side of the world until you have done it in your own home as well, or in your own community, or with the person who has a different political viewpoint from you. I mean, it starts there. So I think when it comes to balance, that's a tricky balance to get right. And we shouldn't ignore one or the other. We should do both. So I think that's worth putting a lot of energy into.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brittany. It was wonderful hearing your presentation. We are going to take a break for 1 minute, and then we're going to come back with our next speaker.